Hello, everyone. My name is Sam, and today I'll be talking about the South China Sea, a topic I've written a research paper on with my mentor, Shane. So, for this project, we chose to look at China and why they so aggressively assert control over the South China Sea, as well as the consequences of such actions. And in this presentation, I'll be giving an overview of my findings. Just note that what I present here isn't all the info I put in my research paper because of the limited time allotted. But before I get into the South China Sea, let me briefly introduce myself. So I'm currently a 16-year-old high school student from Journalism International School, which is a school in Hong Kong. And as many of you know, Hong Kong is a special administrative region of China. My interest for the humanities developed from a young age, where I constantly came across the topic of US-China relations, and more specifically, the dispute of the South China Sea. So because of my geographical proximity and interest, I chose to focus my Polygence research paper on this region of the world. But beyond my own interests, the South China Sea is also incredibly pivotal to not only geopolitics, but also everyday individuals like you and I. It has the potential to upend a near 8-decade-long peace that we have experienced, or at the very least, cause disruptions in our everyday lives. So, when pursuing the topic, I selected three lenses, especially relevant to the South China Sea: the geopolitical, economic, and strategic lenses. So for each lens, I applied existing research from recent years and a variety of theories. These theories include Thucydides' trap, economic liberalism, the loss of strength gradient, and the balance of power theory. I'll get into what each theory actually means when I use them through each lens. And then afterwards, I would give a future prediction and present my own perspective on what Beijing should do to satisfy its own national interests. So here's a brief background of the South China Sea. As you can see on the right, this is a map of the South China Sea with two major island chains called the Paracel in the north and the Spratly Islands in the south. Apart from these two island chains, the sea is surrounded by these seven states, and since the end of the Second World War, the area has been heavily contested by almost every single one of them. Even after the introduction of the United Nations Law of the Sea, which laid out the oceanic boundaries a country was entitled to, the problem remained unresolved. China is the most pivotal player here, not only because it is by far the most powerful, but also because its claims are the most extensive and notorious, as seen by this picture of their nine-dash line. So now we'll look through each individual lens and see just what China has to gain, starting with the geopolitical lens. So, geopolitically, China seeks to increase its foreign influence and limit the US presence in its backyard. The sea's strategic location and economic significance, like trade ubiquity, make it a valuable asset for expanding China's power and influence in nearby countries. Additionally, as China's rise threatens the established hegemony of the US, tensions between the two powers are growing, resembling Thucydides' trap. So this is a theory that entails a rise in tensions and eventually war whenever a rising power challenges an already established power. Control over the South China Sea serves as a point of contention in their struggle for global leadership. Furthermore, China's control over the sea bolsters national pride and makes it harder for other countries to diplomatically punish China, as it provides China leverage to manipulate trade routes. So next, let's talk about the economic incentives. A direct and obvious motive of China's assertion is the resources the sea offers. The region is extremely rich in oil and natural gas, two integral fuels that power the world economy, with there being an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. On top of that, the sea is a massive source of fish for the surrounding countries and provides up to 12% of the world's fish. But most importantly for China and the rest of the world is the sheer volume of trade that flows through the sea. As you can see by this map on the right-hand side, because of Asia's geography, a ship sailing from West to East Asia or vice versa must travel through the South China Sea. This geographical feature affects a multitude of trade routes and equates to a third of all global trade passing through the sea. As touched on before through the geopolitical lens, control of the sea means essentially the ability to control the trade flow, which would give China enormous diplomatic leverage over other countries. This trade is also important, particularly to China, as it allows them to better protect its own trade, which is important seeing as their country largely relies on imports and exports to fuel its economy. Finally, let's look at the strategic lens. Looking at the South China Sea through a strategic lens, the theory of the loss of power gradient plays a major role. Now, this is a theory that states that the further a country is away from a conflict, the weaker it is when participating in said conflict, hence the gradient, and further states that this gradient is nullified by establishing forward positions. The South China Sea has two major island chains, as mentioned before, and thousands of other tiny islands, as well as a shallow water depth suitable for building artificial islands. This means the South China Sea allows for the building of military bases, or, as the theory states, forward positions, giving China the ability to effectively deploy their forces abroad. For China, strategic control over the sea is especially advantageous in the event of a war with the Americans. This is because their southern coast is among the most economically developed and integral regions of the country, yet are relatively exposed to their adversaries. Additionally, the U.S. has an insurmountable military advantage over China, particularly in terms of their naval forces. Control of the sea would help mitigate this advantage, pushing American forces further away from the coast and allowing for a stronger defensive line to be established. So overall, strategic incentives for China boils down to bolstering the military and chance of winning a war. So now that we've covered why China is asserting its control over the South China Sea, let's look at what the consequences actually are. Well, judging from the events of these recent couple of years and the aforementioned theory of Thucydides' trap, it remains likely that tensions between East and West will continue to rise and possibly lead to an outbreak of war. A lot of this stems from the innate fact that China and the US are locked in a competitive rivalry, similar to how the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a competitive rivalry in the latter half of the 20th century. Because of this, neither side are willing to concede any parts of the South China Sea to the sphere of the influence of the other side, as it would weaken their global position. As of right now, the relations between US and China continue to deteriorate, as is evident by the US's naval incursions and the steady reduction in diplomatic and economic cooperation between both sides. But I wanted to look at the situation optimistically. I wanted to see if there was any progress made in terms of peaceful coexistence from both sides. And when you look a little closer, there has most definitely been progress made, albeit maybe more minor. In recent years, China has been making an effort to increase economic cooperation with its neighboring countries, for example, by signing free trade agreements. They have also been putting more emphasis on infrastructure projects in these developing nations through the Belt and Road Initiative. This highlights the viability of the theory of international liberalism. Now, this is a theory that points to a thawing of tensions and a lowering of the chance of war due to increasing economic cooperation and international interconnectedness. Southeast Asian countries now rely heavily on China to fuel their economy, and although it has also decreased, the bilateral trade between China and the US is still very significant for the economies from both sides, which does show a trend towards economic liberalism. Now, if I was the head of the Chinese government, what would I do? What sort of policies would I implement? Well, I think everyone agrees preserving peace and stability should be a top priority. But I also recognize that China is a rising power with its own national interests. So, from my own perspective, China should look to take a friendlier approach with its neighbors rather than an aggressive one. Let's look through the strategic lens again. China's main strategic incentive with the South China Sea is to counterbalance the US's military advantage and improve its national security. But I think China can achieve this not by stretching its oceanic claims, but by forging amicable relations with its neighbors. By pulling the US's allies closer to itself, China can more effectively undermine US influence in the Asia Pacific region and ultimately weaken her strategic position. Forging alliances would also create a buffer to help protect China's southern coast, decreasing the need for military bases. Additionally, closer economic ties with neighbors would also provide mutual economic growth for both sides. Now let's look at the other side. The balance of power theory is a theory that states that when a nation in a given region becomes too powerful, other smaller nations in that same region would ally together to balance out that nation's power. This counterbalancing can already be seen in the South China Sea, specifically because of China's aggressive actions. Surrounding countries, especially the likes of the Philippines and Vietnam, are bolstering their military and turning to the US as a major ally against China, severely diminishing its soft and strategic power. This is also especially detrimental to China, who, as mentioned before, is looking to grow into a superpower, which historically meant possessing soft power and being involved in major alliance systems. Now let's look at the achievability. It's easy to make suggestions without fully considering the reality of the situation, and with what I just said, it does seem a mountain too high to climb for the CCP. But once you take a closer look, it doesn't seem too far-fetched. The Southeast Asian countries right now are rapidly developing and are hungry for capital, infrastructure, and energy. China is an economic behemoth with a massive amount of resources and capital, and is most definitely suited to satisfy this demand. In fact, as many of you know, China is already a massive contributor to the economies of Southeast Asia. For example, China and Vietnam's bilateral trade already makes up 70% of Vietnam's total trade imports. In contrast, the Western nations have done little to support the economic development of these nations, especially when compared to China's massive infrastructure projects put through the Belt and Road Initiative. Another important step China should take is abide by international laws to the best of its abilities. China has on many occasions gone against international law, and it is something that has continuously alienated China the past couple of years. But in order for other countries to truly put faith in the Chinese government, they must adhere to the laws and conventions that they themselves have agreed to. And with enough effort, the Chinese government can most definitely transform their international reputation. So, in conclusion, the South China Sea is an incredibly important yet complex region of the world, a region ripe with plentiful resources and important trade routes, as well as serving as a fierce battleground for the increasingly bitter rivalry with the US. It has also been a significant catalyst in the rising tensions between East and West, and it is becoming one of the most crucial regions in the world of geopolitics. And finally, if I was in charge of Chinese foreign policy, I would direct the country to a policy of alliances rather than aggressive assertion. Thank you for listening to my presentation.